She lost everything for helping a stranger, only to discover he was the billionaire who would change her life forever. The cafe smelled like fresh coffee, cinnamon, and a faint hint of vanilla, comforting scents that wrapped around the small space like a warm blanket. It was late afternoon, and the golden light spilling through the windows softened the edges of the worn wooden tables and chipped paint on the counter. She stood behind that counter, the woman who worked here every day, graceful in her quiet way. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands falling softly around her face, framing eyes that had seen more than they let on. She wore a faded sweater and a calm expression, the kind of tired calm that comes from carrying unseen burdens with quiet dignity. He entered the cafe without looking up, his shoulders slumped just enough to suggest the weight he was carrying. His clothes were plain, a bit rumpled, nothing that hinted at the fortune hidden behind his eyes. His gaze was unfocused, scanning the room like a lost traveler searching for a moment of peace. He hesitated near the door, fingers twitching as if trying to control the restless energy within him. She noticed immediately, the subtle tremor in his hands, the tightness around his eyes, the way his breath seemed shallow and uneven. Most people would have ignored it, but something about him pulled her attention. Maybe it was the loneliness she saw reflected in him, or the quiet desperation that mirrored parts of her own hidden story. Without a word, she prepared a cup of tea, not coffee, the way she sometimes did when someone seemed more fragile than strong. When she placed the warm cup in front of him, her fingers brushed lightly against his wrist. It was a brief contact, almost accidental, but enough to send a ripple of warmth through the coldness he'd been wrapped in all day. Her touch was steady, a silent offering of comfort that didn't ask for anything in return. She gave him a small, tentative smile, the kind that didn't try to fix or judge, just acknowledged. "Here," she said softly, her voice a quiet balm. "It's chamomile. Helps when things feel overwhelming." He looked up then, startled by the kindness, the simple gesture that spoke louder than words. For a moment, their eyes met. There was something unspoken in that glance, a fragile understanding that bridged two very different lives. He could feel the steady beat of her pulse through the thin skin where their hands had touched, a reminder that beneath the surface of her calm lay strength and compassion. As he sipped the tea, the warmth spread through his chest and lingered in a way that was almost unfamiliar, like a memory of hope he'd forgotten he had. The noises of the cafe, the clatter of cups, the low hum of conversation, faded into the background. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen. Not as a businessman or a problem to solve, but as a person. She moved back behind the counter, but the space between them felt charged with possibility. There was no rush, no forced conversation. Just the quiet connection born of one small, human moment, a hand reaching out in kindness when everything else seemed to be falling apart. And somewhere deep inside, he knew this meeting wasn't by chance. It was the first thread in a story neither of them could yet understand, a story that would unravel slowly, weaving their lives together in ways neither expected. The following days slipped by with a quiet rhythm, each one folding gently into the next like the soft pages of a well-loved book. The cafe, once just a place for him to pass through, began to feel like a refuge, not because of the coffee or the familiar hum of background chatter, but because of her presence. She moved through the cafe with a grace that seemed effortless, not flashy or demanding attention, but quietly commanding it nonetheless. Her hands, steady and sure, wiped down tables and rearranged chairs, yet when she spoke to him, her voice softened, and the sharp edges of the day melted away. He found himself returning not out of habit, but out of a need to be seen, to have someone listen without judgment or pity. She asked questions, not the usual polite ones that filled small talk, but the kind that reached beneath the surface, probing gently into the spaces where people often hid their pain. One afternoon, the cafe was bathed in soft sunlight that filtered through the large windows, casting a warm glow over her face. She leaned on the counter, her elbows resting lightly as she studied him with quiet curiosity. There was a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, a mix of compassion and something deeper, a kindness born from experience. "You don't have to say anything if you don't want to," she said quietly, "but you look like you're carrying a lot." Her words weren't a demand, just an invitation. He hesitated, the walls he had carefully built around himself trembling at the edges. Slowly, he found himself sharing, not the polished version he usually wore in public, but the raw, unfiltered truth. How he'd been cut off, how the weight of expectation had pressed down on him until he felt like he was drowning. As he spoke, she listened with a patience that was almost sacred. Her eyes never wavered, her fingers brushing absent-mindedly against the edge of the counter, grounding herself in the moment. Their conversations grew longer, stretching from quick exchanges to lingering talks that filled the quiet spaces between busy hours. She began to notice the small habits he had, the way he absently tapped his fingers when nervous, how his gaze often drifted toward the window, as if searching for something just out of reach. During one slow afternoon, as a breeze whispered through the cracked open door, she reached out, her fingers brushing his wrist when she handed him some napkins. The contact was casual but carried an unspoken tenderness, like a silent promise that he wasn't alone anymore. He felt the warmth of her skin beneath his fingertips, a soothing contrast to the cold isolation he'd been wrapped in. The closeness, the ease between them, began to pull at something inside him, a quiet hope he wasn't ready to admit aloud. She was more than the woman who poured coffee, she was the one who saw beyond the surface. The one who noticed the tremble in his voice and the heaviness in his eyes. The one who, with just a touch and a question, offered a lifeline. As the sun dipped lower outside, casting long shadows across the cafe floor, their connection deepened, not with grand gestures or rushed confessions, but through small moments of presence and understanding. And for the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he could trust someone enough to let them in. The cafe was quieter than usual that morning, the usual steady buzz replaced by an uneasy stillness. She was stacking cups behind the counter, her movements calm but deliberate, when the door swung open abruptly. The sharp clack of footsteps echoed through the room, drawing every eye to the entrance. Her supervisor stood there, arms crossed and face tight with displeasure. His eyes flicked toward the table where she had been sitting just moments ago, talking quietly with him. The way she had been leaning in, listening intently, comforting him, it was something he saw as a breach of unspoken rules. "Is this what you call professionalism?" The supervisor's voice was low, but the tension in it was enough to freeze the air. "You're supposed to keep your distance. You're here to work, not to socialize with customers." She looked up slowly, a soft but firm expression settling over her face. Her voice was calm, quiet, but every word carried the weight of conviction. He needed someone. The supervisor's gaze hardened. "That's not your decision to make. I'm afraid I have no choice but to let you go." The words hit the room like a cold gust of wind, silencing the murmurs and drawing sympathetic glances from the few patrons nearby. She didn't argue. She simply nodded once, almost too quietly to hear. He watched, heart clenched, as she gathered her things. The faint tremble in her hands betrayed the strength she was trying to hold on to. Her purse was small, worn at the edges, and she clutched it like a lifeline as she stepped toward the door. Outside, the air was brisk, carrying the distant sounds of the city, the hum of cars, the murmur of voices, the rustle of leaves in the autumn breeze. She paused, shoulders stiff, eyes cast downward. He wanted to reach out, to wrap his arms around her and promise it would be okay. But instead, he stepped forward slowly, placing his hand lightly on her shoulder. The touch was tentative, full of unspoken apologies. She leaned into it, just enough for him to feel the steady beat of her heart beneath his fingers, a fragile rhythm of hurt and resilience. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with regret. "This wasn't supposed to happen." She shook her head gently, managing a small, sad smile. "You didn't cause this. I made a choice, and I don't regret it." But the ache in her eyes told a different story. They stood there for a moment, caught between the chaos of the world and the quiet gravity of their connection. The sky overhead was turning a dull gray, the light fading fast. Her lips parted as if to say more, but the words never came. Instead, she stepped back, pulling her coat tighter around her as if to shield herself from the cold, both outside and inside. He watched her walk away, the weight of helplessness pressing down on him. This was the turning point, the moment when their fragile bond was tested by the harsh realities of the world. And deep down, he knew that whatever came next, he couldn't let her face it alone. Because in losing her job for helping him, she had risked everything. And now, it was his turn to prove he was worthy of the sacrifice. The evening wrapped the city in a cool, gentle hush. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting pools of soft amber light along the sidewalks. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. He walked beside her, their footsteps falling in an uneven rhythm as she led the way through winding streets toward her small apartment. She moved with a quiet fatigue, her shoulders slightly hunched under the weight of the day's loss. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was heavy, thick with words unspoken and feelings carefully tucked away. His gaze lingered on her, tracing the curve of her jaw, the way her breath formed small clouds in the cool air. Finally, she stopped in front of a modest building, its brick walls glowing faintly in the streetlight. She fumbled with her keys, the metallic jingle echoing softly in the stillness. When the door creaked open, she stepped inside and turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the dim glow from the hallway. Her voice was low, almost fragile. "I've been working 2 jobs for a long time now. This job meant more than just money. It was a place where I felt a little, seen. Losing it feels like losing a part of myself." He listened, every word sinking deep into his chest. The guilt that had been simmering inside him now bubbled to the surface, raw and unrelenting. He wanted to reach out, to fix what had been broken, but he was painfully aware that words alone wouldn't heal the wounds. Her fingers trembled as she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a subtle gesture that betrayed her vulnerability. The faint scent of lavender lingered on her skin, mingling with the warmth of the small apartment. He stepped closer, his voice gentle but earnest. "I never wanted this to happen. If I had known, if I had been honest sooner, none of this would have come to pass." She shook her head, a faint, bittersweet smile touching her lips. "You didn't cause this. I made the choice to help you because it felt right. Even if it cost me." His hand hovered near hers for a moment before he finally let it rest lightly on her arm, a silent apology, a promise of support. The warmth of his touch contrasted with the chill of the evening air, grounding them both. Her eyes searched his, and in that moment, the walls she had built around her heart began to soften. The quiet strength she carried was mingled now with a fragile openness, a willingness to let someone in. He swallowed the lump in his throat and spoke again, voice barely above a whisper. "Please let me help you. Not because I have to, but because I want to." She hesitated, the weight of past disappointments pressing down. Then, slowly, she nodded. It wasn't a surrender, it was a step towards something neither of them fully understood yet. They stood there, the space between them charged with unspoken emotions. The distant sound of a car passing, the faint hum of the city settling into night, all faded into the background as they shared a moment of quiet connection. For the first time, he saw not just the woman who had helped him in a moment of weakness, but someone he deeply cared for, someone worth fighting for. And in that fragile vulnerability, both of them found the courage to hope. The morning sun filtered softly through the curtains, casting gentle stripes of light across the modest room. She had barely finished her breakfast when a quiet knock came at the door, soft, deliberate. The sound stirred her from the haze of exhaustion and worry that had settled over her these past days. When she opened the door, the man she'd come to know stood there, but different. His clothes were no longer the plain, rumpled attire she had grown used to. Instead, he wore a tailored blazer over a crisp shirt, the subtle scent of expensive cologne drifting from him like a new signature. His posture was straighter, his eyes clearer and more assured. The shy hesitance she once saw had transformed into something calmer, more commanding. Behind him, parked just outside on the street, was a sleek black car, unmistakably luxurious, the kind that turned heads. She blinked, the realization hitting her slowly, like the gentle unfolding of a secret she hadn't been prepared for. "I need to tell you something," he began, voice steady but softened by the weight of what he was about to share. What you saw, the struggle I seemed to be in, it wasn't what it looked like. Her heart quickened, a cautious hope blooming beneath the shock. What do you mean? She asked, stepping back inside to let him in. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. I'm the owner of the cafe chain you work for. I was visiting undercover, trying to understand the real lives of the people who make it all possible. I didn't want anyone to treat me differently, especially not you. Her eyes widened, disbelief mingling with a flicker of awe. She looked at him, really looked, and for a moment, the age difference, the world of experience between them, felt less like a barrier and more like a bridge. I never meant for you to lose your job, he said quietly, his gaze searching hers for forgiveness. I was reckless, and I should have been honest from the start. But seeing you, how you cared for me when no one else did, it changed everything. Her breath caught, the air thick with unspoken emotion. The room felt smaller, warmer, as if the distance between them had shrunk in that moment. He stepped closer, but his approach was gentle, respectful, not the confident stride of a billionaire, but the tender reach of someone who had come to rely on her presence. I want to fix this, he said, not just with money or promises, but by being someone you can trust. I want to build something real with you, if you'll let me. Her eyes glistened, a mixture of hesitation and hope flickering within. The vulnerability she had guarded so fiercely began to soften, revealing the deep well of desire for connection beneath. She reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead, a simple touch, but charged with meaning. I never cared about your money, she whispered. I cared about you. His smile was slow, genuine, the kind that warmed from the inside out. The weeks that followed felt like a gentle unfolding, like petals slowly opening to reveal something fragile and beautiful beneath. He had offered her a new position within the company, a role that promised stability, respect, and dignity. Yet, for her, the true gift was not the job itself but the quiet way he stood beside her as an equal, not as a distant boss or a wealthy benefactor. Their moments together grew longer, softer, filled with subtle touches and lingering glances that spoke volumes without words. One cool evening, they found themselves sitting on a weathered bench just outside the cafe, the world around them softened by the muted glow of street lamps and the faint hum of night settling in. She wrapped her coat tightly around her, but he noticed the slight shiver that ran through her when the wind teased loose strands of hair across her face. Without thinking, he reached out and brushed the hair gently behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her skin like a whispered promise. The warmth of his touch was a stark contrast to the cool night air, sending a quiet flutter through her chest. She turned toward him, eyes wide and searching, a question lingering there, hesitant, unspoken. He met her gaze steadily, his own eyes reflecting a mixture of admiration and something deeper, a tenderness that seemed to gather in the space between them. Are you scared? He asked softly. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Not of you. Of what this could mean. Of wanting more than I should. He reached for her hand, their fingers entwining naturally, like two pieces fitting together after a long search. The simple contact grounded them both, a shared anchor amid the uncertainty. You're the one thing I want without doubt, he said quietly, his thumb brushing over the back of her hand in slow, soothing circles. Days stretched into evenings filled with quiet companionship, sharing stories over coffee, walking through the park with hands occasionally brushing, exchanging smiles that lingered just a moment too long. Every touch, every glance was measured and respectful, the slow burn of their connection kindling warmth in places neither had thought to feel again. In moments alone, she found herself noticing the small things, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, the way he listened intently even to the smallest details of her day, the gentle pressure of his hand when they passed something delicate between them. One afternoon, as the golden light spilled through the cafe windows, she caught herself leaning a little closer than usual, her shoulder brushing against his. The brush of skin was electric, sending a shiver up her spine. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and for a heartbeat, the world narrowed to just the two of them. There was no rush, no need to force what was growing between them. Instead, they savored the quiet intimacy, the closeness of their bodies, the steady beat of two hearts learning to trust one another, the unspoken promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. In that slow, careful dance of affection and vulnerability, love took root, soft, steady, and impossible to ignore. The early morning sun spilled through the large windows of the small cafe space, bathing the room in a soft, golden light that seemed to promise new beginnings. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint aroma of jasmine from a small vase of flowers on the counter, delicate, understated, yet full of life. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of calm that comes after a storm has passed. She stood near the entrance, eyes bright with a mixture of surprise and disbelief, as he led her inside. The space was hers now, a dream she hadn't dared to voice aloud, a place where she could build something steady, something real. He watched her carefully, the way her fingers brushed lightly over the polished wood, the subtle smile that touched her lips. "You didn't lose your job because of me," he said softly, voice warm and steady. "You lost it because you chose to be kind. And kindness, true kindness, is rare. What you did was brave." Her gaze met his, and in it, he saw the layers of fear and hope, pride and vulnerability. She took a slow breath, steadying herself against the rush of emotions. Then, with a quiet confidence, he added, "I want to build a future with you. Not as your employer, but as your partner. Someone who stands beside you, not above you." Her hands trembled slightly as she reached out, cupping his face with a tenderness that spoke of everything left unsaid. Her thumbs traced the lines of his cheekbones, the softness of his skin a stark contrast to the strength she felt in his gaze. "This," she whispered, "is everything I didn't know how to ask for." His arms encircled her waist slowly, pulling her close in a gentle embrace that was more promise than possession. The warmth of his body against hers was steady, grounding, a sanctuary from the uncertainties they had faced. Their foreheads rested together, breaths mingling in the quiet morning light. Outside, the city stirred awake, but inside the cafe, time seemed to pause, holding space for something fragile and precious to take root. She smiled then, a full, genuine smile that reached her eyes and softened the lines of worry that had lingered for too long. He smiled back, the kind of smile that says, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Their hands found each other again, fingers intertwining as naturally as if they'd always belonged that way. "I don't care about the years between us," she said softly, voice filled with certainty. "What matters is this, what we've built, what we choose to be." He nodded, his heart swelling with a quiet joy. "Age is just a number. What matters is the honesty between us, the respect, the care, the love." In that moment, surrounded by the soft hum of the cafe and the warm light of a new day, they stood together, not as boss and employee, not as man and woman divided by circumstance, but as equals bound by something far deeper. She rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. His hands held her gently but firmly, a silent vow that this was only the beginning. Together, they stepped forward into their future, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that they had already found something rare and true. In that small, sunlit room, the truth of who he was and who she was began to intertwine. The walls they had built to protect themselves started to crumble, making way for a bond neither had expected but both desperately needed.